Well, it's great to have you guys. We are very glad to be able to start up our second semester, our online live interactive class here, and we're going to be studying Pastoral Epistles. I am very excited about this, and I've been looking forward to this class and to this study. I've been working on our notes now for the past couple of months, and they're really, for pastors, there really isn't a more vital study than to consider the books of 1st, 2nd Timothy, as well as Titus. We do have the course notes. Hopefully you guys have had a chance to look at those as well. So those are the course notes. Thank you, Pastor Lowell, and maybe Pastor Harry, did you help the binding with that? We're grateful. Yeah? No? You've passed off the binding? Yeah? So we're just glad to be able to have you guys, and glad for us to be able to begin the study. So just to lay down how this course works, we're going to go through our notes, and we'll give opportunities for discussion along the way. If you happen to have a question, just chime in, and we'll try to take those questions as they come up, and we'll work through those details. What you'll see is over to the side, you'll notice we'll have the course notes and the material. At times we'll bring up our Bible software, Logos, and there may be times I make a note on kind of like a whiteboard. But again, anytime you've got a question or something you want to work through, please just kind of raise your hand or ask or just speak up, and we'll try to work through that. So once more, we're starting the Pastoral Epistles, and in the front section we have our syllabus, which details information about the course itself. So this course is an in-depth study of Paul's letters to Timothy and to Titus. So that means 1st Timothy, 2nd Timothy, and the book of Titus. And we're going to deal with text critical issues that surround the pastorals, and that will be followed by a thorough exegesis of the biblical text. This course is going to spend more time dealing with the introduction to the pastorals than what we did with our study in 1 Corinthians. And the reason is because there are so many questions that surround the pastoral epistles that we want to work through and really try to answer and get to the bottom of. All right, so our focus here is on the pastoral epistles with a heavy emphasis on the text critical issues, the questions that surround the pastorals, and then we're going to jump into the actual text, and that will be maybe our 3rd class or even our 4th class when we finally get into the text itself. Now we're going to examine this course through lectures, which is what we're doing right here, our reading, which we'll talk about later, as well as reports. Now, when you finish this course, so we're going to have 3-hour sessions, and we're going to have 10 weeks of these 3-hour sessions. When you finish this course, I hope, first of all, you will grow in your skill of interpreting and applying scripture, especially within the epistolary genre. So to be better at handling the letters of the New Testament. Also, I hope you'll be able to recognize the main themes and the movements within the books of 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. And I also hope that you will be able to have a firm grasp on the main themes of the books of 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, Titus, as well as the pastoral epistles themselves. And you'll see this. We'll look at the word clouds, and I've given you those in your notes, and we'll deal with those in just a little bit. And then letter C, the third thing I hope that you'll gain is a deeper appreciation for and a more thorough understanding of the pastoral epistles. Just like our study in 1 Corinthians, I don't know about you, But after I work through 1 Corinthians, I feel like I know the book of 1 Corinthians. I feel like I can work through that text. There aren't major unanswered questions in my mind anymore. I have a lot of questions. I don't know the answers to everything, but at least I know most of the questions now. And I know the major themes, and I've worked through that text. So 1 Corinthians to me, because we've studied it, feels like an old friend. Well, I hope the Pastoral Epistles, when you get to the end of this class, will feel like an old friend. That you understand the themes and the movements and the flow and the arguments. And so we're going to do that and work through that together. Also, you'll notice that I hope as we work with the tools, right? Bible software, commentaries, you'll become more familiar with them. Letter E, again, what we'll cover at the very start of our course is I hope you will be able to point out the deficiencies, that is, the weaknesses of critical scholarship's attack on Pauline authorship of the pastorals. So let me say it this way. Critical scholarship, liberal scholarship that rejects the authorship by Paul of these letters, I want you to be able to show their weakness, the weakness of their point of what they are saying. And we'll work through that. And again, by the end, I hope you'll be able to defend the fact that Paul, in fact, wrote these 3 letters. And they are Pauline. They are thoroughly Pauline. And then I hope you'll be able to identify, that is, pick out, and then ultimately defend your view on some of these difficult topics. So I hope you will be able to express your view on the pastoral qualifications. Okay, one in particular, what does it mean to be the husband of one wife, right? To be a one-woman man. What does it mean to be blameless? So we're going to work through the pastoral qualifications. I hope that you'll be able to express your view clearly and defend it as far as what women's roles in ministry ought to be, and whether you would land on the complementarian or the egalitarian side. Okay, so you'll understand those terms. You'll be able to express your views and hopefully be able to defend those views from Scripture, especially from 1 Timothy chapter 2. So are you a complementarian? Are you an egalitarian? And how can you defend your view in that? We'll also work through the issue of deaconesses. All right? When it says the women that are referenced in the qualifications of 1 Timothy 3, you'll have the chance to think through, are these women deacons? Are they deaconesses? Right? Because there is no feminine form of the word deacon in the first century. So are these deaconesses or are these deacons' wives? And you'll be able to work through that and hopefully come to a firm conclusion. And then church governance. What is the church supposed to look like? How is the church to be led? Do we have a 3-tier system like we'll see at the time of Ignatius, where you have deacons and elders, and then you have these bishops, these hierarchical leaders? Or are there just 2 where we have the office of deacon and elder? So we'll work through those issues. And then I hope by the end you will also be able to clearly articulate and apply the biblical qualifications of pastors and deacons. So that's a vital component of this study. What does God expect from you as a pastor or as a deacon as you lead the church? What are the qualifications? What is required? So we'll work through that. Our primary text is from William Mounce, his book on Pastoral Epistles, and just a very helpful text. That will be what I encourage you all to read, and we'll have some reading for you. I also lean heavily on George Knight's book in the commentary on the Greek text. So this is part of the New International Greek Testament Commentary, and this is an excellent resource. I really appreciate the work and the study by George Knight. Now these two guys, if you look at William Mounce and you look at George Knight, both of these guys would label themselves as complementarians, which means they believe that women are not given authority to preach, and they are not given authority to be in the role of pastor. And so both of them would be complementarians. Towner, which is the other book I rely on, he would be a complementarian. So he would say that women are permitted to preach. I don't know if he would go as far as to say that they are permitted to fill the office of pastor, but he would definitely say that they have the ability to preach and to teach. And also, these notes are quite extensive, so this really should serve you well as an additional commentary. And I hope you'll preach through these books at some point, and you'll be able to use these notes as reference as you study and as you prepare sermons. So our focus in the notes is on an exegetical study. This is not necessarily an outline for preaching, though you could use it as that. The main goal is to give you the background so that you have material to then be able to perform the study, to prepare a sermon or a sermon series through the book of 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. As far as attendance, you are here. Thank you for being here. Please be here. Yes, please be here for all the lectures. If you happen to miss a lecture, we will be posting these just like we did for 1 Corinthians. So these lectures are going to be available. It's on our website, havenofgraceph.org. If you miss a lecture, please message me or talk with Pastor Llewell, and we will make sure to get you set up with that. Reading, by the end of the semester, we're going to ask you to have read 300 pages in our course textbook, which is by William Mounce, and we will get that to you. We will make sure that you have that available before the end of the semester, and Pastor Llewell will give you some of the instruction as far as that. Now, there's going to be a 4-page report required by the end of the semester or shortly after. For those of you who have already taken the class on 1 Corinthians, please work on that report if you haven't turned it in to Pastor Llewell already. So I know some of you have finished that and have turned that in. And I'm looking forward to reading those. I can't wait to read your views on some of these issues. Maybe head coverings or speaking in tongues. So it's good for us to do the study. Now, what I'm going to require for this report is that you deal with one of these difficult topics that will be brought out throughout our study. And here's the list below, but in the report, 4 pages, you need to have these 4 components, 4 parts. First, in that difficult topic, I want you to exegete the text and the surrounding context of that issue. So if you're going to deal with whether women are permitted to preach, then you need to deal with 1 Timothy chapter 2. You need to exegete that text, look at the surrounding context, and then you need to set forth what are the possible interpretations that others have provided on this text. So I want you to think through and work through some of the possible interpretations. And then I want you to tell me what your interpretation is. What do you believe the text to say? And then how this applies to the church today. And that's an important component, that you think through the issue, but then you also apply that to the church today and make sure that we have a good understanding of that. Again, as I mentioned, here's some of the topics you could work through. Women's roles in ministry. 1 Timothy 3, are we talking about deacons' wives, or are we talking about deaconesses, the office of a deaconess? Pauline authorship, you could defend the Pauline authorship of the pastorals, or you could defend your view of church polity. Do you believe in a congregational rule of church? Do you believe in elder rule? Do you believe in a hierarchical rule? So you could deal with that. And there's other subjects that you could work through and deal with. You could talk about widows, and if it is a formal order of widows, or if it's just a roll, a listing of widows that would qualify. So you could do the one woman man. You could tell me what your view is on that statement. So does that mean that a man cannot be married a second time, that he can't be a widow and remarry and be a pastor? Does it mean that he can't be divorced? Does it just mean that he has to be faithful to his wife, and it doesn't matter if he's been divorced in the past? Only what matters is the present. So that you could deal with any of those topics, any of those subjects, but if it's not on this list, just ask me and I'll be happy to make sure we work through that and deal with that. The way your grade will be determined, attendance and class interaction will be 30%. What's that?
So I said that if you can receive a C grade.
Yeah.
I'm used to it.
He's hoping. He's got high hopes. That's good. So just be here and interact. I love to hear questions and comments, your vantage point on things. We'll have your reading, and then your report really helps me see that you're assimilating the information, you're working through the information. All right, these are the word clouds. We won't spend a lot of time on this right now, but I do want you to see for 1 Timothy, as we start, that really the main theme, I would argue, of 1 Timothy is that healthy doctrine will lead to godly living. That really is the thrust of the letter Paul writes to Timothy. That healthy doctrine, sound teaching, sound doctrine will lead to godly living. And we're going to talk about some of the major themes that course through this, the qualifications of a pastor here, the house of God and the leadership of the house of God, the bishop and overseer, all the quarrels that are entering in through these false teachers, the importance of ministry and the gospel. Honor becomes a prominent theme throughout the book. To honor elders, to honor widows, to have slaves honor masters. The gifts that God gives, being an example. Again, even in the qualifications, dealing with a one-woman man and what that means. Conduct, the spirit, deacons, those who are rich. So we're going to deal with all these themes as we work through the book of 1 Timothy. Then when you get to 2 Timothy, really, I would argue the main theme, it's a very personal letter, but Paul is encouraging Timothy to endure. So a faithful minister endures, and they endure suffering, as you see there. And we'll work through this. And one of the main themes is that Timothy would not be ashamed of Paul as a prisoner of the Lord, that he has a genuine faith, and Paul is a preacher and a teacher who's been entrusted with the gospel. But in the last days, evil men will grow worse and worse. But Timothy is to be an example. So that's going to be our study of 2 Timothy. And then Titus, really, I would argue the theme of faith and good works. That we have this emphasis of faith, our hope in Christ, and then the emphasis of good works being in there. Okay, so that's going to be our study as we work through these particular texts. So we're going to start our introduction. Before we do, any questions on anything we've looked at up to this point, anything that you're not sure about what is expected of you or what would be required throughout this semester. So let me just pause. Any questions you guys might have at this point? We're good to go? Everybody good?
I have a question.
Yes.
So I saw the link that you share in our conversation. So like twice a week, this class will be twice a week. Yeah.
Okay, good question. Thank you. No, this class will meet just once a week. We offer it in another location, which is about 45 minutes south of Maranatha, but it's the same class. So you would, yeah, you only have to be here on Monday. So Monday is the only day that you need to be here for that. Yeah. Good question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Yes. So it's Monday afternoon for you guys, and we'll be meeting. It'll be a total of about 3 hours at about 6 o'clock Philippine Standard Time. We'll take a 30-minute break and then come back and finish out. So that's why it'll end at around 8:10 Philippine Standard Time, and I think you guys are an hour and a half behind them, I believe.
Yeah.
Something like that. So that'll be the layout. So if you guys want to have a snack or eat your dinner, that'll be about the time. So I'm getting everybody hungry. I mentioned the word dinner. I know that's dangerous. So I'll try not to get everybody too hungry, but it's good to see everybody. And so let's jump into our material here and our introduction. Okay, we're going to start out and just want to talk briefly about how we interpret epistles. And we're going to really fly through this section because we've covered these notes in the past, and I really just want to touch on them. I don't want to spend a lot of time on them, but I do want you to realize that even though we refer to these as books, right, the book of 1 Timothy, book of Titus, we should note at the start that these books are actually letters. Okay, so they're not books in the traditional sense of the word. So these are letters, or what we use the term as epistles, right? Comes from the Greek word epistolos. And epistolary literature forms an important genre within Scripture and makes up a large portion of the New Testament. So the bulk of the New Testament are epistles, right? We've got 27 books in the New Testament. Okay? Take out the Gospels and the book of Acts, and really the rest are epistles, except for Revelation. So it really is the bulk of our New Testament. It is the bulk of Scripture for us. Now, what is an epistle? Well, it's simply a letter of correspondence between two or more parties. And again, it's the form in which several or most of the New Testament books were originally written. And epistle is generally synonymous with letter. So when that word comes up in the New Testament, it's generally translated as letter, or we can understand it as a letter. Although there are times that term epistle is regarded as a more formal correspondence, and a letter is more personal. So a lot of times you'll find that the general epistles, or the Catholic epistles, like Hebrews, James, 1st, 2nd Peter, that these are more formal, and they're often referred to as epistles, whereas Paul's letters are usually referred to as personal letters. And so sometimes people make a distinction because Paul's letters are written to specific churches or to specific individuals. And we can break down the epistles as Pauline or non-Pauline. That's a simple breakdown. And Paul wrote 13 epistles. If you believe Paul wrote Hebrews, then you would say Paul wrote 14 epistles. And then the rest are known as the Catholic epistles, or the general epistles. Okay, so again, a lot of notes. Just read through them at your leisure. We're not going to spend the time to look at them because we have a lot of material to cover. Now, what are epistles made up of? There's always going to be an introduction, there's a body, and then there's a conclusion. This is an example of a letter that was written around 200 AD, so 100 plus years after the New Testament. This is written by a Roman legionnaire, so someone that was part of the Roman army, and you can see just a letter that's written on a scroll here, or a piece of writing. I'm not sure if this was parchment, or if this was on vellum, or what it's on, papyrus, but this is an example of that. And you can see the Greek script here. Hopefully you can see that, the Greek script throughout, and you can even pick out words as you would look at this. Now, as we think through this, again, there's introduction, there's the body. Within the body, just to be aware, many of the letters, or these epistles, are divided into two main sections, a doctrinal section and then an ethical section. Now, we're not going to find this as much in the pastorals, and we didn't really find it as much in 1 Corinthians. But if you study a book like Ephesians, it's very clear, or Romans, it's very clear that you have two main sections, foundation that's laid in the doctrine that is then applied in the second part of the letter. It'll have a conclusion. In the process of writing, we will deal, especially in the pastorals, with the issue of a scribe, and that being one of the reasons that there may be differences in the phrases, the terms, even the writing style. So, for me, I can read through the pastoral epistles. If I read through the pastoral epistles in Greek, I notice that it's very different in many respects from some of Paul's other writing. And that's been noted over the past 150, 200 years. And that's what has caused people to question Pauline authorship. And so we'll deal with that extensively in this study. But my answer is that Luke is likely the scribe, or the term amanuensis. He is likely the scribe who wrote the pastoral epistles. And there's three general levels of scribal activity in the first century. So the first level, a letter could be dictated word for word, and the scribe simply writes it down. Second level, the contents could be told, but the actual wording and style would be supplied by the secretary, by the scribe. So that includes some moderate scribal involvement. Okay, the third level, which we don't have any example of in the New Testament, would be that the author simply tells what he wants to be written, the general concepts of what he wants written, and the scribe actually writes it all and comes back for the person to simply sign off on what's been written. Again, we don't have any evidence for the third here, but it does seem that the first two are pretty evident throughout the New Testament, and very likely the differences between 1st and 2nd Peter are the result of the level of scribal influence. And the pastorals as well seem to have a strong scribal influence, or the influence of an amanuensis. And many believe, as I do, that Luke was the amanuensis for the pastorals due to the number of Lucanisms. Sections that seem to have Luke's hand, because we've got so much material written by Luke. Right? We have the Gospel of Luke, we have the book of Acts, and now if the pastorals were written by him as far as a scribe, authored by Paul, but Luke was the scribe, that makes sense for how closely associated it is to what Luke had written. And that's going to be our argument, and that's going to answer a lot of our questions, I believe, as far as the stylistic differences between the pastorals and the rest of Paul's writing. Now, talking about how do we interpret epistles? Okay, one of the key issues, one of the key hermeneutical understandings that will help you unlock the meaning of many texts within the epistles, not just the pastorals, but all throughout, is to recognize the occasional nature of the letters. That these letters are occasional. Well, what does it mean for something to be occasional? It doesn't mean that they're trivial or carelessly written. What scholars seek to emphasize when they say that the New Testament letters are occasional, especially the Pauline letters, is that Paul wrote his letters to meet specific historical needs. So it's not like Paul didn't have anything better to do and thought, maybe I'll sit down and write a treatise or a theological essay for anyone that might be interested. Paul isn't just wasting his time or just writing for the sake of writing. He's always writing to address particular issues. Occasions are drawing out these letters. So there's always a concrete occasion that motivated Paul to write these documents. So there's always a reason, and that reason is vital for us to understand so that we're able to make sense of what is being written. Now, most of our problems in interpreting the epistles are arising or come from the fact that they are occasional. And we have the answers, right? We have what Paul is addressing, how he says to deal with whatever is happening. The problem is we don't always know what the questions are or the issues that are arising that Paul wants to address. Just like in Corinthians, we had such a hard time in Corinthians trying to figure out what exactly is the issue, right? What's the problem with the head coverings, or with the gift of tongues, or with the food offered to idols? What is the real problem? Statements that are made in 1 Corinthians. It is good for a man not to touch a woman. Okay, well, Is that Paul saying that? Is that Paul quoting something the Corinthians are saying? Is it Paul just quoting a general maxim or statement or view that's out there? We have to deal with those questions, but they remain questions, and we're not sure at times. So we spent a lot of time with that, dealing with that in Corinthians. But our problem is we don't always know what the question is or what the issue is. But we have to look at the epistle and try to determine, okay, why did Paul say this? Who are the opponents that Paul is trying to deal with? What does it even mean that they are saying that the resurrection is past? Well, what's that even mean? Well, we're going to have to think through that and try to work through that as we study. It's been likened to hearing one end of a telephone conversation, right? When you read the letters of the New Testament, especially Pauline letters, you're hearing one end of the conversation, and you're trying to listen and hear what that person is saying, but you want to understand what the person on the other end of the line is saying as well. But you can only determine what they're saying based on what you're hearing, because you're only getting one side of that conversation. So it's a difficult task. Studying the epistles is a very difficult task because we've got just one side of the conversation, and we have to reconstruct what's happening on the other end. And you have to be careful, because if you make a wrong assumption, then everything is built on that assumption, and if it's wrong, then your conclusions are often wrong. So we have to be very careful, and we will be very careful as we study. Closely tied into the occasional nature is the historical background that surrounds the letter. So we want to dig in as much as we can to the background to the letter. Now, how do we know what the historical context of these letters are, right? Because we're given some details, but we don't have all the information we want. Well, the book of Acts does provide a good framework, but we're going to argue that the pastorals were likely written after the conclusion of the book of Acts. So that may be helpful for a book like 1st or 2nd Thessalonians or Corinthians or Ephesians. But what do we do with a book that's written after Acts concludes? Well, as a rule, as a general rule, we can depend on internal evidence, right? We can look at the book itself, look at the letter itself, and use the internal evidence to pull out information from that letter about that letter. And so that really is going to be our primary source of being able to study and to understand. Now, here's some basic hermeneutical principles. What's our recommendation to dig into the study of the pastoral epistles? Well, first and foremost, the primary recommendation is to sit down and read it. All right, so read the books of 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus. And that's your homework for this week. I want you to read through the pastoral epistles. I want you to read through 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. If you can read through it 5 times, read through it 5 times. Just get into that text, because it'll help you as we work through the study. So let's do that. Read through the text as many weeks as you're able before class. Read through the text, work through the text, study it, so that you have a good idea of what we're covering, and you'll be on pace with what we're studying. So again, just read through the text. That's probably the most obvious but most important aspect of study. Okay, so again, we have to just get into our material here, but you can take time and read some of the rest of the notes that we've been covering. Okay, now we are jumping into our overview and background. like I said, it's going to take us a while to actually get to 1 Timothy, which is our first study. I think about the first 60 plus pages of notes are dealing with the background and the issues of critical scholarship. So don't get lost, because we're going to spend a lot of time dealing with those issues. But just try your best to track along. I think this part is helpful. It's fascinating, but there's going to be a lot of questions about the background in particular of the pastoral epistles and how it fits in the timeline of Acts and after, and how we kind of piece what was happening together. So we're going to come to a conclusion. We don't have all the answers. We're going to use as much information in the books themselves to piece together what might have happened. But again, we're going to be left with some questions and not have all of the answers that we want. Now, so let's talk about the pastorals. Let's talk about this overview in the background. 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus have been known as the pastoral epistles from about the 18th century. So they've been titled or labeled pastoral epistles from about the 1700s. But as early as the 2nd century, they've been grouped together within the broader Pauline corpus. So the Muratorian canon, for instance, we're going to see groups them together. And so they are clearly viewed as a unit because of their similarities and the themes that they cover. Now, they stand in very close relationship to each other. They're very different from the other Pauline letters, which, except for Philemon, were written to churches. Okay, so there's 4 letters that Paul wrote to individuals: 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, Titus, and Philemon. But these letters are written to fellow workers of the Apostle Paul to encourage them concerning their pastoral duties. And we'll talk about it. They're not really pastors. And that's another wrinkle in our study. Timothy's not a pastor, right? Titus is not a pastor. He is in a position that we don't have today. He really is Paul's delegate. He's Paul's representative. So the term we're going to use, Timothy, Titus, they serve as apostolic delegates. Okay, so how does that affect our interpretation of their function and their role? Well, we'll talk about that as we work through it. Now, the similar content of these 3 letters obviously binds them together and makes them a special group among the Pauline letters. You'll notice throughout the course notes this abbreviation, just the letters PE. Okay, so that's the abbreviation for pastoral epistles. So all throughout the notes, instead of writing that out every time, you'll often find just the letters PE. You see that, you're aware that that simply means pastoral epistles. Sometimes it'll be referred to as the pastoral letters. Sometimes they'll just be called the pastorals. So just be aware of that. Anytime we use any of those terms, we're talking about the same thing. Now, since they comprise a closely knit group, they may, in large part, be considered together with respect to questions regarding their authorship and related material. So you're familiar. They group Paul's letters. Sometimes they might group the prison epistles together, right? So Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, Philemon. They group different letters together based on their themes. 1st, 2nd Thessalonians, 1st, 2nd Corinthians. A lot of these letters are just grouped together. And of course, we have the pastoral epistles. And the distinguishing qualities of each letter, dealing with the recipients, right? Individuals who are serving Paul as his representative, over churches in specific regions, cities, or areas, and also the historical situation. They're written about the same time. We're going to look at them together, but then we also look at them independently, and we'll notice, pretty major differences between 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy, for instance. Very similar, 1 Timothy and Titus. They have a lot of similarities, but we'll notice some differences between those letters and the letter of 2 Timothy. Now, these letters give the impression of being personal letters, but they contain a curious combination of materials. It really is an interesting letter. All three of them are interesting letters. We have these sayings, right? Paul says this is a faithful saying. Well, he never uses that phrase in any other letter. So why does it show up here? Well, we have these sayings. We have these other theological pieces. Sometimes there's a piece of a hymn or part of a doxology, and they stand out within their contexts, and these occur in greater proportion than elsewhere in Paul. Again, Paul never ever uses that formula, this is a faithful saying, or this is a trustworthy saying. He never uses that formula anywhere else in his letters, except in the pastorals, where it shows up 5 times. So they are different in some respects. And then it's very strange at times that he seems to shift, right? Paul shifts from personal advice, and then he'll jump into some public advice that he's writing to these co-workers, but you can tell that even though the letter is technically private, it's written to an individual, it's public in intent. So it's private in form. I'm writing to Timothy, I'm writing to Titus, but it's really meant for a broader audience. He's expecting Timothy to read this letter to the church, and for what he writes to be authoritative, right? It has authority coming from Paul to Timothy, but really through Timothy to the Ephesian church. Or it's written to Titus, but really it's through Titus to the church on Crete. So that becomes an important component as well. Then when we deal with 2 Timothy, it's more personal. It's much more like a typical Pauline letter than 1 Timothy and Titus. And 1 Timothy and Titus are pretty closely related to each other. And then 2 Timothy is pretty different in its character, the genre, as well as the purpose. And it's not surprising. We shouldn't think that is unexpected because of who Paul is addressing and the circumstances that surrounded it, once we take those into account. Now, as far as authorship, we talk about the authorship of the pastorals. Every one of these letters all claim to be written by the Apostle Paul. Okay, so Paul says, I'm writing to Timothy, I'm writing to Titus. So Paul addresses these recipients, but he says it's coming from me, Paul the Apostle. We look at the recipients. We have Timothy and Titus. They're addressed as spiritual sons, and we'll talk about that. And they are instructed as those that work under the authority of the apostle. Again, the best way we could describe them would be apostolic delegates. And we don't have those today. There's no apostolic delegates because there's no apostles with us today. And so they are serving and working under his authority as an apostle. And this description fits with what we know about them and their relationship to Paul from other letters and from what we see in the book of Acts. And this becomes an important point as we argue against critical scholarship, right? As we think of like the lower criticism, when we deal with these issues, these are important points to counter the critical scholarship's denial of Pauline authorship. So critical scholars, liberal scholars, say Paul did not author the Pastoral Epistles. And we would counter and say he most certainly did. And these letters refer to specific events and places, and they are written in relation to these events. We find that 1 Timothy is instructed, he's writing to Timothy, and Timothy was instructed to remain in Ephesus to withstand false teaching. Titus, in the same idea, he's left on Crete to see that elders are chosen and installed in every city. So that will address the issues of the churches by installing healthy, sound leaders. And there are references to the life and the present situation of Paul and to Timothy's situation in almost every paragraph of 2 Timothy. So these are very direct and personal letters explaining what Paul expects from these individuals. These 3 letters certainly claim to be by Paul, who is the former persecutor of Christians, who was called to be Christ's apostle, the same apostle who traveled far and wide throughout the Mediterranean world, the Roman world, preaching the gospel, suffering for it, who also continued to feel responsibility for the churches and for his apostolic delegates, and who continued to deal with actual situations and individuals in specific places. So it falls in line with Paul's mode of operating within Paul's ministry, that he starts these churches, and as a father, he expresses his concern for these churches. And that's evident in every letter that he writes. It's clear in Thessalonians, it's clear in Corinthians, it's clear in Galatians and Ephesians and Philippians. These are churches that he is intimately connected with, and he writes out of concern, out of a fatherly concern, to address these issues that keep popping up. False teaching or immoral situations. Paul is as a good father, attempting to address these and provide leadership and guidance. So, the self-testimony of the letters, again, all 3 letters starts out Paul, right? Paul, an apostle. Paul, a servant. So the self-testimony is most explicit in the identification of the author in the first verse of each letter. But the fact that it comes from Paul is evident because it's also repeated, and it's pervasive throughout the personal references that the author makes about himself and about his relationships with the addressees and other individuals. So it's clear Paul is the one writing these letters, and he's making personal references about his own life, his own ministry, how he was formerly a persecutor. He was injurious to the church. He persecuted the church, but God showed him mercy. There's personal references to friends like Demas who forsook him, how Luke was alone with him. He was the only one that stayed with him. Alexander the coppersmith, and Hymenaeus and Philetus, and Titus and Tychicus and Artemis, all these names of people who are connected with the apostle. So with this background, it's not difficult to understand why the almost unanimous consensus of the church until the 19th century was that the letters were written from Paul the apostle. So up until like the 1800s, for the last 200 years, there's been questions, but up until that point, the unanimous consensus, the church believed these letters to be written by the apostle Paul. And that is a strong testimony. That's a strong witness. And one of the reasons we should also emphasize and stress Pauline authorship of these letters. Now, the church as a whole and specific groups of the church, the church members are instructed through Timothy and Titus. Sometimes it's more direct, right, where Paul is addressing the church. And sometimes it is less direct, where Paul is encouraging Titus to teach them to do this, or Timothy teach them to teach no other doctrine. So Paul's addressing the church, but there's times when that is direct and there's times when that is indirect. But again, by either method, Paul is writing to the whole church. He's writing to the church at Ephesus. He's writing to the churches on Crete. He's writing to Timothy and Titus. He's also writing through Timothy and Titus to these specific individuals. All right, let me pause there. Anybody have any comments up to this point? Any questions that you might have?
I used to think that Pastoral Epistles were written directly to the pastors in the church. So the way I understand these epistles, that these epistles were written to the pastors in Ephesus in Crete. So what is the bearing, or what is the effect if we look at these epistles as Titus and Timothy are just pastoral delegates, as we look at these epistles? So what is the difference? What are the factors that really affect our way of understanding?
Well, I think when we understand, first off, that Timothy and Titus aren't pastors, that is a pretty important understanding to begin with. That they are in place, like Titus in particular. His job is to establish pastors in these churches under Paul's authority. And by doing that, by having godly men whose lives exemplify the gospel, so we have godly men who are put into these positions of authority, that will address the issues that are arising within the churches on Crete, as well as the church in Ephesus. Like, if you remember, when Paul leaves the Ephesian elders in Acts 20, you remember the account? Paul's passing by. He calls all the elders down to Miletus, about 30 miles south of Ephesus, and he has all the Ephesian elders come and gather with him to say goodbye to them. He says, "I'm not going to see your face anymore." Paul, in that, he kind of makes a prophecy that wolves were going to arise among themselves. And that's an important statement. That wolves will arise from within yourself. Meaning that there are going to be false teachers, leaders, who arise within the congregation that are not going to spare the flock. So, even in that statement, Paul is prophesying that the issue there is going to be in the leadership, right? And that's why the qualifications are so important, because the leaders were the problem. You have these people who want to be known as teachers of the law, right? That's the word that's used in 1 Timothy. Law teachers. So the issue is the leadership. So Paul is addressing Timothy to make sure you don't lay hands suddenly on any man. Because if you do that and they go off into sin, you've become a partaker with them. You've become a partaker of their sin. You've enabled their sin. So some men's sins are obvious, right? Going ahead before them into judgment. And some men's sins are not obvious. And that's what Paul tells Timothy. So don't lay hands on anyone suddenly. Make sure you know that man's character. Make sure you can see the witness of his life and his testimony. So I think that part's important. Paul is writing to Timothy, but he's addressing the church as a whole, which includes the pastors as well as the deacons. So he's really, it's kind of a broad shot. It's written to Timothy, but Paul has in mind the whole church with a focus on the leadership. So that's probably how I would answer that.
So it is right to think that the status of the church, that Timothy as pastoral, as apostle delegate, and then the pastors, the deacons and members. Is it right to think that way?
It is, and that's where, for us as Baptists, right, or Bible church, that sounds almost like the Catholic hierarchical setup, doesn't it? Right? So that's where we have to make sure we have a sound ecclesiology, because that's not what the church looks like in most of our churches. We don't have this, they would call it a monarchical bishop, right? The monarchical bishop. We don't have a bishop over one city who then appoints pastors and then deacons. We would have a two-tier system where we have elders, bishops, and deacons. And that's why, again, I would argue that we don't have apostolic delegates because we don't have any more apostles. The Catholic Church would say we believe in apostolic succession, meaning that the rights of the apostles, the authority of the apostles has been handed down and continues through the Pope. That would be the Catholic view, and they would then say that the Pope is the high bishop, the primary bishop, who then is given authority over the churches. But we don't see anything in Scripture that speaks of any type of apostolic succession, that this would continue on. And that's why we're going to spend a lot of time dealing with that issue. But we have to understand that Timothy and Titus are not pastors in the traditional sense, but that they are given instructions how to relate to pastors and how to establish pastors, because that's what is needed in the church.
So last little thing. So it is not wrong to have a direct applications to pastors, as we take the passage when this passage directly addresses to Timothy. Right. Now, there's always going to be application that we need to make, and I just talked to someone about this today, or yesterday morning at church. You could become so narrow in your interpretation and application that nothing in the Bible applies to us, right? Because there literally is nothing in the Bible that was written to you, right? There's no first Luell, or first Philip, or first Romeo. There's no letters that are written to any of us. So you can become so narrow in your interpretation that nothing in the Bible applies to you because it wasn't written to you. Well, we can always make application. So Timothy, even if he's not a pastor, he's in the role of ordaining pastors. So a lot of what Paul writes to Timothy now has a direct application to pastors, even if Timothy isn't a pastor himself. So we can always make application. Now, that application is going to be dependent on how closely aligned we are to that situation. And
since we're dealing with the Pastoral Epistles, and we're dealing with the establishing of churches and leadership, pastors, deacons, there's going to be much that we can apply directly. But there's going to be commands in there that we don't apply at all, right? Do any of you obey the command to bring the cloak from Carpus's house to Paul? None of you have ever obeyed that command. And you don't even feel bad about it, right? You should feel awful that you've disobeyed God's command. But that's an imperative. Bring the cloak I left at Carpus's house and the parchments. Okay? Well, that's a command that you have completely disregarded in your life. Well, we know why, because that's a temporal command. It's not really for us. It's just information. So we just have to be wise in how we apply some of these commands. Make sure that it's suitable and fitting and appropriate for our situation today. All right, good. Any other questions or comments of what we're looking at?
Can I ask you one favor?
Yes.
Can you speak a little bit slower?
Yes.
Yeah.
I will.
Because,
I will try to speak a little slower. Yes. I usually speak very slow. Because I've been in the United States so long, I have forgotten. I'll do my best to speak slower. Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Yep.
It's okay. Yeah, we are trying to concentrate, but sometimes it's to go too fast, so I can catch all of them. But I'm trying to.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It takes. Yes, I know. It takes work. Your brain is probably explode. Yes. Okay. Any other questions, or are we good? Good. Okay. All right. So let's talk about Acts chronology and the Pastoral Epistles. Now, much scholarship has been invested in the relationship of the Pastoral Epistles and the timeline that's laid out in Acts. I'm going to argue that the Pastoral Epistles are written after Acts 28. So there are some who would try to say that we have to fit the Pastoral Epistles in the book of Acts. I would argue that it's almost impossible to fit the Pastoral Epistles in Acts before Acts 28. Okay, so we're going to deal with that issue, hopefully work through that issue. Now, what do we have as an account in the book of Acts? Paul and Barnabas traveled on an evangelistic mission to Lystra, Iconium, and Derbe, which we'll find out later is Timothy's home. This is where Timothy is from, according to Acts 16. Although on the first missionary journey, Timothy is not mentioned. So no mention of Timothy on Paul's first missionary journey. Then when Paul takes his second missionary journey, you remember he's moving through Asia Minor, and his intention is actually to go more north and east into the region of Bithynia, but the Holy Spirit forbids him. So when we look at this, Paul meets Timothy, and their intention is to go further into Asia, but the Holy Spirit forbids them. And what we find is that when Paul meets Timothy in this general area, right, Lystra, Iconium, Derbe, Timothy is already a disciple, and with Paul's paternal language, speaking of himself as a father, Timothy as a son, it suggests to us that Paul led Timothy to the Christian faith, that Paul shared the gospel with Timothy. And it's very possible that Timothy was one of the many converts of the Apostle Paul during the first journey, but that it wasn't until the second journey that Timothy stood out to Paul. And then these prophecies that were made about him and the gifts that were given to Timothy in serving the Lord. We also find Timothy's mother and grandmother were also believers. We are given the names of his mother, Eunice, and his grandmother, Lois, and they both had a sincere faith. As we find in Acts 16, Paul wanted Timothy to go with him and to serve with him. And from that point on, from Acts 16 on, Timothy becomes Paul's assistant. And he continued as his friend and co-worker all the way until the end of his life. And Timothy and Silas remained at Berea. As they begin traveling, they make it over into Macedonia, to northern Greece. Now they're in Europe. And when Paul was sent away because of the agitation of the Thessalonian Jews, he travels down into Athens, and he requests Timothy to join him as soon as possible. From Athens, Paul goes to Corinth, and there Silas and Timothy are with him, and they serve in Corinth for about a year and a half, a long time. Now, if you remember when they made it to Berea, right? This is before Athens, before Corinth. They initially received a warm welcome, but when the Jews from Thessalonica arrived and caused dissension, Paul left for Athens, right? Silas and Timothy remained in Berea, presumably to instruct the new converts in their faith. So Timothy is a gifted teacher, and Paul uses his skills in catechetical instruction. That is the word catechism, or teaching of these new converts. Now, during that period, Timothy and Silas are co-workers with Paul, helping to establish the Thessalonian church, right? That was the church they ministered in before Berea. And they are included as co-authors. And I would agree to an extent with that they are included as co-authors in both 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. And you'll notice, if you look at 1st Thessalonians, 95% of the verbs are first person plural. In other words, we are, or we were, or we did. So I don't know that means it's co-authored by Silas and Timothy with Paul, but it definitely has an important point for us to consider. Now, once we get to Acts 19, we have this indication that Timothy was with Paul in Ephesus on his third missionary journey. So now, the third missionary journey. If you remember, the second missionary journey, Paul made his way into Macedonia and Greece. He stops in Ephesus very briefly before heading to Jerusalem. And he says, I'm going to come back to Ephesus if I can. Well, that's exactly what he does on his third missionary journey. And he's there in Ephesus for about 3 years. So again, we're working through kind of our timeline in our mind to understand where the pastorals might fit in, and specifically the places like Ephesus or Crete and where they are in Paul's ministry. Okay, so we're going to keep moving through this section. Timothy is in Ephesus when Paul writes to him. He's still in Ephesus when Paul writes 2 Timothy. Timothy is mentioned only one other time outside of the pastorals or Acts, and he's mentioned in Hebrews 13:23. He is referred to as our brother, who himself has now been released from prison. And there's good reason to believe that this is the same Timothy. There's a few historical events that help us date what's taking place in Acts. The Edict of Claudius that expelled Jews from Rome. Okay, that's in around 49 to 50 AD. That helps us pinpoint Paul's time in Corinth. And then Gallio's term as proconsul in Corinth in 52, 53 AD. Felix replacing Festus as governor in Caesarea. The Feast of Unleavened Bread in 56 to 58. And then Nero's death in AD 68, which provides a ending point for Paul, because tradition tells us that Paul was executed under Nero. Okay, again, some of the background. I'll let you read some of these details, and anything if I speak too quickly, go back and read after class. Go back and read some, and hopefully some of that will fall into place as you work through that. Okay, so again, we're looking at Paul's travels. Let me show you this map. Okay, there's 3 missionary journeys, and there's a journey to Rome when Paul was imprisonment, when he was a prisoner. Now, remember that Paul is in Antioch of Syria. You know, there's a Pisidian Antioch up here, but the Antioch in Syria was Paul's home church. You remember that's where they first used the term Christians, referring to followers of Christ. And it becomes, after Jerusalem, Antioch becomes really the center or the hub of Christianity. And you'll remember in Acts 13, the Spirit says, "Separate to me Paul and Barnabas. I have a work for them to do." They begin their travels, and their primary location of ministry on the first missionary journey is in Asia Minor. All right, so he's in these regions of Galatia and of Cilicia and Pamphylia, right? He's in these regions ministering, and he makes his way back to Antioch after his journey. You come to the second journey, and you'll notice these are the sections of Acts that correlate to this journey. So these are helpful maps. It's helpful for me to be able to see where Paul traveled and to piece this together with the account we have from the book of Acts. So again, as we see Paul's travels, this is really the major shift in his ministry. He's traveling through these regions, again, same area as his first missionary journey. And you'll remember he's ministering here in Phrygia. He's in Mysia. He's ministering here. They want to go into Bithynia and Pontus. So they're wanting to travel north and east, further into Asia, right? They want to go into Bithynia. But the Spirit forbids them. Okay? So it's around this region that Paul meets Timothy, who probably was saved during that first missionary journey. Paul meets Timothy or sees or understands the prophecies of Timothy, of God making prophecies about his ministry, and he brings Timothy along. They travel. They want to go over here. God doesn't allow them to, and they land in Troas. And it's in Troas that Paul receives a Macedonian call. And then they leave. Their first ministry stop is in Philippi, and then Thessalonica, Berea. Now remember, Timothy is with them throughout this portion of Paul's ministry. He was picked up here, Lystra and Derbe. They come up. They want to go here. Spirit says no. They wait in Troas. Macedonian call. They arrive in Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, Athens, and then Corinth. He travels to Ephesus, and in Ephesus, he says, I will come back if I can. I want to come back. And then he makes his way to Jerusalem. Okay, then he's in Jerusalem and back up to Antioch. And then that leads us to his third missionary journey. Again, launching out from his home church in Antioch. Same course. He's traveling, but now he's going to spend 3 years in Ephesus. Okay, so that becomes very important. 3 years in Ephesus. And I would argue that the Ephesian church is one of the most important churches in the New Testament, because we have so much that centers on this church. And I would argue we know more about the Ephesian church than any other church in the New Testament. Right? We have the book of Ephesians written by Paul. Paul spends 3 years there ministering in Ephesus. We have the books of 1st and 2nd Timothy. If tradition is accurate, John spent his later years in Ephesus. So we have the books of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. And then we have Ephesus spoken of, right, in Revelation. When Paul says, or when John writes that they had left their first love. So we get a chance to see a church in its birth in Acts, its infancy, as Paul writes to them in the book of Ephesians, as well as 1st and 2nd Timothy, as Paul writes to Timothy, who is overseeing the church. And then we even get to see its demise once we get to the book of Revelation. So the Ephesian church is an important church for us. So this is Paul's third missionary journey. We find this in Acts chapter 18 through chapter 21. And then we have Paul's voyage to Rome. This is not his fourth missionary journey. This is his voyage to Rome. And you'll remember the uproar in Jerusalem, the imprisonment in Caesarea for about 2 years, and then his call to be tried in Rome. He says, I want to stand before Caesar. And you remember their travels. They do stop in Crete, but Paul is not free. He doesn't preach in Crete. They simply stop there. And then you remember the storm that they faced, and then his imprisonment in Rome. And that's where the book of Acts ends out. The book of Acts leaves Paul under house arrest in Rome. And he's there roughly 2 years. Okay, so those maps are very helpful to help us pinpoint where things are at. All right, let's go ahead and jump back into our study. And hopefully we will get through this next section, and then we will be done and ready for the rest of our course. Let's talk about the recipients of the letters. All right, who are Timothy and Titus? 3 things stand out about Timothy. Timothy had a strong religious heritage in his own family. He was trained in Scripture from his youth, and even as a young man, he had a strong commendation from the churches in his area. Timothy was faithful throughout his ministry. He was a consistent co-worker with and assistant to Paul, who regarded Timothy as one of his most trustworthy and dedicated associates, and someone the apostle could assign difficult tasks to. In regard to his personality and temperament, equally striking is Timothy's apparent timidity and need for encouragement. And that becomes something one of the authors takes issue with. One of our authors, I believe it is Mounts, says that we have overstated Timothy's fearfulness or timidity. And we'll talk about that when we get to those passages. But to me, it's clear that Timothy needs encouragement along the way, and maybe struggles with fear or being timid as he faces many of these challenges. Now, Paul addresses Timothy as his spiritual son. So we will see this when we get to 1 Timothy 1. But Paul writes to this younger man, Timothy, as his own spiritual convert, possibly. We're not told that Paul led Timothy to faith. But the fact that Paul spent time in his first missionary journey in the same area where he meets Timothy on his second missionary journey, or brings Timothy with him on his second missionary journey, it seems like Paul probably led Timothy to faith in that first missionary journey, and then takes him with him as he travels on his second missionary journey. Again, we don't have anything definitive, but that would be an assumption. And so he has spiritually nurtured Timothy, and now Timothy serves Paul as a son would serve his father. Paul and Timothy's relationship was unique. Paul said, "I have no one like him." There's no one like Timothy, Paul says in the book of Philippians. Someone that would care for the Philippians just like Paul would. I have no one like Timothy. Timothy was a longtime friend and a trusted co-worker of Paul, and Paul repeatedly sends him into difficult situations, often to confront, to correct, to encourage, to help them maintain loyalty to Paul and to the gospel. Much, if not all, the teaching in the Pastoral Epistles is directed towards the church, even though the bulk of 1 Timothy is intended for the Ephesian church. It is still a personal letter in style. So we think about the recipients of 1 Timothy. It's written to Timothy, but again, the church is in view as well. Now, let's take a look at Titus. Titus is the addressee of the letter bearing his name, as we find in the salutation, the greeting, in Titus 1, verse 4. Titus is mentioned by name 12 times in the New Testament. He was a Greek who remained uncircumcised. Remember that? And maybe we'll talk about this, but You remember when Paul takes Timothy, what does Paul do? He circumcises Timothy at the very start of that ministry, on that journey. And yet, when Paul takes Titus, he does not circumcise Titus. He remains uncircumcised. And so this becomes a bit of a test case for the gospel with reference to the Gentiles. How Jewish do the Gentiles need to become in order to be saved? And with Titus, the answer is clear. They don't have to become Jewish. You don't have to become Jewish or get circumcised to be saved. And so Titus becomes Paul's partner and a fellow worker among the Corinthians. Remember, Titus is the one Paul sends to the Corinthians to help them gather the gift that they had pledged and promised before. He took several difficult assignments in Corinth. You remember, it was Titus who was sent to Corinth to help them and to deal with the very difficult situation that had arisen between Paul and the Corinthians. And from the letter to Titus, we can see that Titus had accompanied Paul to Crete and then was left there to strengthen the work. Apparently, Titus rejoined Paul at Nicopolis as he requested in chapter 3. Right? Come to me in Nicopolis before winter. And by the time Paul writes 2 Timothy, Titus is now north of Nicopolis in Dalmatia. And there's a tradition that says that Titus returned to Crete and he served as the bishop there, overseeing the churches until his own age. Titus is referred to as my true child in the common faith, very similar to what Paul calls Timothy. The only difference is the addition of the word common before faith. Now, let's try to line up the chronology as best we can after the book of Acts. So I'm going to argue that the pastoral epistles are written after the book of Acts. So Acts 28 ends with Paul in his first Roman imprisonment. And again, my view is that Paul was imprisoned in Rome under house arrest for that period of about 2 years. After that, he was released and he enjoyed a season of ministry, maybe 5, 6, 7 years of ministry. And it was during that time that Paul ministered on Crete and that he wrote 1st and 2nd Timothy and the letter to Titus. So this theory that Paul had 2 Roman imprisonments creates the space needed for the travels and the ministry that's indicated by 1 Timothy and Titus, and yet is unmentioned in the book of Acts. So 2 Timothy, when we come to that text, that depicts Paul after he's been re-arrested. Now, there are some, I guess, who would try to fit 2 Timothy into the book of Acts, and they would say that Paul wrote 2 Timothy during the Roman imprisonment that's described in the end of the book of Acts. However, it seems like these are different imprisonments, and we'll talk about why these appear to be different imprisonments. So Paul's in prison at the end of Acts, a Roman imprisonment under house arrest. And my view is that Paul is freed from that first imprisonment. He travels, he ministers over a period of years. He writes 1 Timothy, he writes Titus. Then he's imprisoned a second time. But this second imprisonment is much more severe. This is not house arrest. This is in a Roman dungeon. This is living in a Roman prison in the ground. Very difficult situation. So that seems to be the best explanation for what we find in 2 Timothy. So this becomes an important point for us. Now, the map that I'm going to show you in a second, it's in your notes. The map designates the potential travels. And just notice the word potential. There's nothing on this next map that is set in stone. These are potential travels after Acts 28. And since we don't have any scriptural account of these travels, we have to proceed with caution. We can't be certain on most of these details. And don't confuse, you'll see Paul's fourth journey. Don't confuse Paul's fourth journey with Paul's journey to Rome, right? He had his first, second, and third missionary journey, and after that he traveled as a prisoner to Rome. The next map I'm going to show you is a possible reconstruction of Paul's journey after that first Roman imprisonment. Now, you could spend a lot of time looking at this map. I think it's a very helpful scenario. This is possible, but we can't say for certain. So it's very possible that right after Paul's imprisonment in Rome, that he immediately travels to Spain. So that is very possible. From Rome, he travels to Spain, after which he returns and very possibly spends time on Crete. Okay, so these are just possibilities. It's also possible that Paul left Rome and then immediately traveled to Crete and spent a period of time ministering on Crete, and then he left Titus to serve there. We don't have a lot of the details for us. The only way we can reconstruct this map is by pulling out from 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus some of the details that Paul describes. Like he talks about meeting Timothy and there being a tearful parting or a tearful visit. He talks about Titus coming to him in Nicopolis, and he mentions other places, Miletus. So we're trying to reconstruct as best we can. If I had to guess, I would say Paul probably left Rome, went to Spain, or left Rome, went to Crete, ministered in these general areas, possibly went to Spain. There's just too many variables and questions we don't have answers to. Though most commentators now assume the pastorals were written sometime after the accounts recorded in Acts, I do want you to know there are some who try to place everything within the framework of Acts. That Paul writes 1 Timothy, and when he writes 2 Timothy, he's in the Roman imprisonment described in Acts. But most commentators today say, no, the imprisonment in Acts seems different, seems less severe than the imprisonment that Paul describes in 2 Timothy. So the best analysis would be to say that Paul was imprisoned under house arrest in Rome at the end of Acts. Acts concludes. Paul is released from that first imprisonment, he spends a number of years traveling and ministering. Very likely, he makes it to Spain. He spends time on Crete. He ministers back with Timothy again. He travels to Miletus, to other areas. He's arrested a second time in Nicopolis, or on his way to Nicopolis. And after that second arrest, he's placed again in Rome, and it's in Rome that he dies. So we're going to work off of that assumption in our study, that Paul is imprisoned at the end of Acts. He's released. He ministers for a period of time, possibly in Spain, likely on Crete, and then he's rearrested, and then he dies at the end of that second imprisonment. Okay, so what we have in Acts, remember the temple riot in Acts 21. They believed that Paul had brought Trophimus, a Gentile, into the temple, and they said he defiled the temple. There was a 2-year imprisonment in Caesarea Philippi, and then 2-year open house arrest in Rome. Now, some historical sources, we're talking outside of the text of Scripture or the book of Acts, some historical sources suggest that Paul's expectation of being released, that came true, that he was found innocent and he was released from this Roman imprisonment. Now, when you look at the end of Acts, Paul had not yet gone to trial, and many would argue that Paul went to trial, he was found innocent, and therefore was released. And there are a number of reasons Paul may have been acquitted. Possibly his accusers didn't appear in court. There's other possibilities. But while we cannot prove this scenario, neither can we prove that Paul died at the end of this Roman imprisonment. In fact, the historical sources tell us that Paul did not die in this first Roman imprisonment. Clement, who was the bishop of Rome, the traditional location of Paul's death under Nero, just 30 years after Paul's death, shows an awareness of details of Paul's life that we don't find recorded in Acts. So this is a quote from Clement, the bishop of Rome. He speaks of Paul showing the way to the prize of endurance, and he makes the statement, when Paul reached the limits of the West. Okay, here's the phrase, the limits of the West. Clement says, Paul gave his testimony before the rulers and thus passed from the world. So Clement's position in Rome, he's an important figure in the early church, makes this tradition significant. His church could have still had members who witnessed Paul's final imprisonment. And Clement's statement, the limits of the West, most likely refers to Spain. And in the book of Acts, we have no record of Paul ever reaching Spain. So if Paul did go to Spain, that would be covered in the book of Acts. But if he did go to Spain, then it had to take place after Acts 28 concludes, after the Roman imprisonment. Now, it is generally acknowledged that the most natural meaning of the limits of the West is a reference to the Pillars of Hercules at the Straits of Gibraltar, which is Spain, as far west as you can get in the Roman world. And so these are references, historical references we can match to other historians. Now Eusebius, now he's much later than Clement. Eusebius in the 4th century adds the following, that tradition has it that after defending himself, the apostle was again sent on the ministry of preaching, coming a second time to the city, and suffered martyrdom under Nero. During this imprisonment, Paul would have written the letter to Timothy, the second letter to Timothy. And there are many writers after Eusebius who show an awareness of the same tradition. So this is a very reliable historical tradition within the church, that Paul was imprisoned at the end of Acts, he was released, he made his way to Spain, he ministered, he was rearrested, and that's when he died in Roman custody under the reign of Nero. And one thing I would point out, it's very important, especially significant, that there is no contradictory tradition asserting that Paul died at the end of his first imprisonment. In other words, no ancient source claims that Paul died at the end of Acts 28 when he was in that Roman imprisonment. No ancient source claims Paul was martyred at the end of that imprisonment. The only accounts we have show an awareness of Paul traveling after that imprisonment, ministering in Spain, and then later rearrested and dying at the hands of Nero in the second imprisonment. So these are arguments from silence. We don't have the account, but what seems to fit best is what we have laid out up to this point. Now, we have questions, and we're going to have to just leave these questions because we don't have definite answers. Paul never himself says, I went to Spain. Remember, in the letter to the Roman church, the book of Romans, Paul says, I want to go to Spain. But he never says he is going or has gone to Spain. So, when did Paul go to Spain, if he did? When did he go to Crete? Because Acts does not record Paul preaching on Crete. They stop over on Crete as he's imprisoned. He's a prisoner. They stop on Crete, but he does not have freedom to go about and to preach. Did Paul write first to Titus, or did he write first to Timothy? How quickly after Paul's first letter to Timothy did he write the second letter? There's no way for us to know. Again, Paul never preached in Crete in the Acts account. And yet, his letter to Titus suggests a missionary journey of significant length. The church there was newly established and quite visible and had many locations, suggesting a large number of converts. Now, we do want to note that there were Cretans present on the day of Pentecost. And that to me makes sense. You know, when we talk about the pastoral qualifications in 1 Timothy, we get to chapter 3, we have qualifications for pastors, and then we have qualifications for deacons. So that tells us that the church in Ephesus, 1 Timothy, Ephesus, that the church in Ephesus was more structured because you had both pastors and deacons. When we come to Titus 1, the qualifications given are only for pastors. So that might indicate to us that the church on Crete was not as established it was a newer church than the church in Ephesus. But what I would argue is this: there were likely people from Crete who on the day of Pentecost heard the gospel, were saved, and returned to the island of Crete and began to preach the gospel. Now, they only knew the simple message of salvation. And up to the point when Paul finally makes it to Crete, towards the end of his ministry, he probably found a very immature church. A church that had been established by those that came back from Pentecost, but it's still a very young church in the sense of how much teaching they had received. They may have only received the simple gospel message that was preached on the day of Pentecost. But now they've come and they've established churches. Paul, later in his ministry, after Acts 28, he comes to Crete, probably finds a church that exists but needs very clear teaching. They are lacking sound teaching. And he evangelizes on the island, preaches Christ, churches are established, and that would allow for a church that's been established but is very young in their understanding, that needs leaders, that needs elders to help guide the church. Now, once more, we have a hard time piecing together this timeline, this chronology. But we do have these events that we know have taken place. So when we think about how to reconstruct the letters to Titus, the letters to Timothy, the letter to Titus, we know that Timothy was with Paul during his Roman imprisonment. Either before the trial or after the trial, Paul sends Timothy to Ephesus to deal with the Ephesian heresy. And we see that in 1 Timothy 1. It's possible that Paul went west to Spain as he intended, as he wrote his desire to the Romans, and as we find in church traditions. Then at some point, Paul took Titus and they went to Crete on a missionary journey. Paul wanted to go east, especially to Ephesus, to help Timothy. And this is what we find in 1 Timothy 3 and 1 Timothy 4. Now, we have some questions about this because when Paul left the Ephesian elders in Acts 20, he says, "I'm not going to see your face anymore." So if Paul did return to Ephesus, either what he said in Acts 20, he was mistaken and he would see them again, or he actually never made it to Ephesus, even though there's some indication that he wanted to return or did return there. And then number 5, Timothy met Paul somewhere while Paul was on his way to Macedonia, and Timothy returned to Ephesus. So once more, we don't have all the details, but we can reconstruct some of these events based on the internal evidence, what Paul writes to Timothy and Titus. So this is a hypothetical layout or chronology using the little data that we have. So if Paul did travel to Spain, it's possible he went there immediately after his release at the end of Acts 28. If he went to Crete first or to some other location, he may have met Timothy, and he would have to then retrace his steps to go back west towards Spain. And then he would have to return to Crete and Macedonia. If he went to Spain first, then it's likely he was only there for a short time. And after he returned, he would have gone to Crete with Titus. He could have also gone through Macedonia, and Timothy could have left Ephesus to meet him on the way. And if that is the tearful visit he refers to in 2 Timothy 1:4, it's possible that this was Timothy's first visit with Paul after his release. So, from that scenario, that's probably the best understanding of where these letters fit in. So it assumes Paul and Titus make a missionary journey to Crete. That is after Acts 28 and sometime before Paul's second imprisonment. So again, this reconstruction is probably our best guess. He's in prison in Rome at the end of Acts 28. No imprisonment is an easy imprisonment, but this is under house arrest. It's not a severe imprisonment. Possibly he goes to Spain. After returning, he ministers in Crete. He meets up with Timothy somewhere in Macedonia. At some point, maybe in Nicopolis or on the way to Nicopolis, Paul's arrested a second time. He's then imprisoned in a harsh imprisonment in Rome. And it's at the end of this imprisonment under Nero that Paul dies. That's the best guess that we can offer as far as the timeline. Now, as we mentioned, there were Cretans in Jerusalem at Pentecost. And so it's possible that Paul found a church in Crete when he arrived. Again, there's also indication that Paul's ministry in Crete was somewhat extensive. However, depending on what dates are accepted for Paul's first release and his second imprisonment, there's probably not much of enough time to see a journey extending beyond a year. So we're again just trying our best to piece these things together to try to determine exactly what is happening and how to understand this. All right. So let me just pause there for a second. Do we have any questions at this point? Any questions that you guys have regarding Paul's travels? I might not be able to give you answers because there aren't enough details in Paul's letters to really make a firm determination on some of these. But any questions that you guys have in regard to Paul's travels or what we've covered up to this point?
Looking what is the ground for the imprisonment of Paul?
Well, the first imprisonment was when there was a riot, and Paul caused a riot because the Jews thought that he had defiled the temple by bringing a Gentile, Trophimus, into the temple. They believed that he had done that, which he did not do. But they caused a riot, and Paul is saved from being killed in that riot, and he's imprisoned in Caesarea Philippi, which, when you understand the Roman government, Caesarea Philippi was the central command. So Caesarea Philippi is the most important place in the area of Palestine, and that's why Paul is brought there. And you remember, this is when he appears before Felix and Festus. It's at the end of 2 years, Paul appeals to Caesar. He says, I will stand before Caesar. I choose to be tried before Caesar. And it's at that point they travel to Rome. And that's where the shipwreck happens. You remember that? The really big storm. Paul's shipwrecked. They're going to kill the prisoners. That whole account. Paul makes it to Rome. And then he's released, I believe, after Acts 28. We don't know when. But he spends at least 2 years under house arrest in Rome, after which he is released, I believe. And then he travels again, and he's arrested. We don't know exactly why Paul was arrested the second time. Does it have something to do with Alexander? Maybe. Alexander the coppersmith did me much harm. So maybe Alexander had a part in Paul's arrest. We don't know. But he is arrested for preaching the gospel. And he's then brought to Rome for a second imprisonment, which by this point is extremely harsh, extremely severe. And it's at the end of that imprisonment that Paul is martyred. All right, any other questions? We're good? Any other questions? Good? Okay. All right, so let's jump back in. All right, let's see. We don't know where Paul wrote these letters. If Paul wrote this letter and the first letter to Timothy at the same time, so if Paul wrote Titus and Timothy at the same time, there's a chance he was somewhere in Macedonia, so possibly from Macedonia. There are a lot of similarities between the first epistle to Timothy and the epistle to Titus. Most argue that 1 Timothy and Titus were written about the same time. The style and the vocabulary are very similar. The content is very similar. Both letters show a concern for proper leadership and give many of the same qualifications. We will notice that when we get to 1 Timothy 3 and then Titus 1. Almost identical qualifications. Blameless. One woman man. Very, very similar statements that are made. And so most commentators believe that 1 Timothy and Titus were written around the same time. Some believe that Titus was written first because there's a more lengthy introduction, but there's no way to know which of these letters was written first. Now, when we come to 2 Timothy, Paul is clearly back in prison. We see that all throughout the letter. And again, part of our problem as we try to reconstruct this is we don't know if the events Paul alludes to in the letter happened before or after his arrest. So we, again, don't have all the details we wish we had. Maybe in heaven God will reveal all those details to us. We don't know. But Paul is clearly in prison at the time he writes 2 Timothy. So here's a further detail, a further scenario. It's possible Paul never reached Nicopolis. He may have been arrested as he was traveling to Nicopolis and then taken to Rome. So instead of staying in Nicopolis, Titus would have continued on to Dalmatia, further north. And it was late summer. If it was, Paul wanted Timothy to come quickly, to come before winter, so that he'd have his cloak, he could be warm. But if there's not enough time for that to have occurred, then it is possible Paul reached Nicopolis for the winter. Titus would have spent the winter with him and then departed for Dalmatia in the spring. Paul may have been delayed by the winter, still wanted to visit Timothy and to visit Ephesus, possibly got as far as Miletus before being arrested. Trophimus became ill at some point either before or after Paul's arrest, and he stayed behind at Miletus. When Paul says, I left Trophimus in Miletus, it suggests that he was with Trophimus in Miletus. So possibly they would have traveled north through Troas, and it would have been there Paul left his cloak, his books, and his parchments. Maybe Paul was arrested in Troas. That would make sense. And a short-term arrest would explain why he left those items. But then we'd have a hard time placing the visit to Miletus. Once more, I think we're left with the basic statement, we don't really know. Paul is traveling. He's making a lot of stops along the way, but we don't know the exact locations of where he's going, of when he's arrested, and what happens after that. Paul was taken to Rome, but this imprisonment, this second imprisonment, was nothing like what is recorded in Acts 28. It was much more severe. So much so that Onesiphorus, who's mentioned, had to search diligently before finding Paul. That's not trying to find someone under house arrest. You know, people could come and go and visit with Paul while he was under house arrest at the end of Acts 28. He's not under house arrest during the second imprisonment. Onesiphorus has to diligently search for him. And so he's imprisoned as a serious criminal. His lack of shame at Paul's chains and Paul's encouragement to Timothy that he would not be ashamed, the fact that Paul says, everyone in Asia has deserted me. He was abandoned by Demas, one of Paul's inner circle. Again, this all points to the seriousness of this imprisonment. The presence of Luke, who's a physician, and Paul's desire for a warm cloak may also point to a difficult imprisonment, although Luke was also a friend and winter was coming. Paul's eulogy of his impending death in chapter 4, verse 6 through 8, shows that he knew he would not be released. Whereas, if you read Philippians 1, Paul's in prison there, and yet Paul is confident in Philippians 1 that he is going to be released. That he says, this will turn to my deliverance, to my salvation through your prayers and the supply of the Spirit of Jesus Christ. So Paul believes he's going to be released from the first imprisonment, but what is clear in 2 Timothy is that Paul does not believe he will be released from that imprisonment. So piecing all of this together, it gives us the picture of two separate imprisonments. One is under house arrest, not severe. The other is in a Roman dungeon, where it's a very harsh and severe imprisonment. Now, while the courts had given Paul an initial reprieve, right? This is the first defense that he's talking about. And this was the custom in Roman trials. You basically had two trials. One was to determine whether the charges were valid to be tried. So it's kind of, we would call it a preliminary hearing. The first trial was to determine the charges and to see if they were valid. And if they were valid, then you were moved to your second defense, your second trial. Okay, Paul says, at my first trial, no one stood with me. It was during the first trial you could bring in character witnesses who would support your testimony or your character. Paul says, no one stood with me at my first trial, my first defense. But there would be a second trial, and it would be the second trial that would lead to the verdict. In Paul's case, it led to the verdict of death, of judgment. So Paul is given an initial reprieve after the first trial. He's imprisoned, he's still a prisoner, and he's awaiting his second trial. Paul believes that he will be condemned to death at the second trial. Again, very different from what Paul believed from the first Roman imprisonment, where he said, I believe I will be released. Now, according to tradition, Paul was beheaded at the Aqua Salviae, near the third milestone on the Ostian Way. And Eusebius, 4th century, he places Paul's death in Nero's 13th year. That would be AD 67. Whereas Jerome places it a year later. So very likely Paul is martyred AD 67, possibly AD 68. Okay, so that's some of the chronology that we're trying to work through under this scenario. Now, 2 Timothy, when we understand the setting of 2 Timothy, we acknowledge that this letter is almost totally unlike the other two letters in the Pastoral Epistles. While it shares a similar literary style, in almost every way it is different. 2 Timothy is much more of a personal letter, and it's filled with encouragement and personal comments, and references to false teachers is virtually non-existent, except for just a couple of places. So 2 Timothy is a very different letter, has a different feel. Paul wants to encourage Timothy in the face of suffering. As he thinks about his spiritual father's imminent death, Paul is trying to encourage Timothy. And that's why when you get to the end of 2 Timothy, when Paul says, no one stood with me, everyone has forsaken me, only Luke is with me. When you get to the end of 2 Timothy, Paul says, yet out of all of this, the Lord will deliver me. And he will bring me safely into his heavenly kingdom. So Paul knows he's going to die. Paul acknowledges that he has been forsaken by everyone. And yet he reminds Timothy that the Lord has not forsaken him. And that's an important point for us, isn't it? Have you ever felt like you've been forsaken by everyone? You feel like you're all alone? You feel like the burdens just keep piling up? And yet, Paul reminds Timothy, he tells him, don't be discouraged. Even though everyone else has forsaken me, the Lord has not forsaken me. The Lord is with me. And we need that reminder as ministers. We need that reminder on a daily basis that the Lord is with us. God is gracious. He is present. He is an ever-present help, always present with us. And that's an important reminder for Timothy. That's an important reminder for us today. Now, the historical situation of 2 Timothy is also unique. If 1 Timothy and Titus were written about the same time, which is very likely, it's clear 2 Timothy is written later. Paul is at the end of his life. He knows that his work is done, right? I have fought, past tense. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the course. I have kept the faith. These are all past tense verbs. He says, I am done. My life is ending. And I've been faithful to the Lord. So Paul is at the end of his life. He knows that his work is done. Years of Roman imprisonment. Remember, 2 years in Caesarea Philippi, 2 years under house arrest in Rome, and now a second Roman imprisonment. That certainly would have an effect on both his thought and his expression. You know, one of the big things that the critical scholars, the liberal scholarship, argues that Paul could not have written the Pastoral Epistles is because of the different terms he uses, some of the Latinisms. But if Paul was in prison in Rome and had spent the better part of his final years in Rome or in Roman custody, then it makes sense that he would use more Latin terms. That just makes sense. So it's not that we have a new author. It's simply that Paul is now being influenced by the surrounding language that he's immersed in, as Latin was spoken in Rome. Also, Paul is writing to individuals. So his letters are going to be different. If he writes to individuals, specifically close friends who are serving with him in the gospel, that kind of letter is going to be very different from a letter that's written to a church. So these are all formative events that could greatly affect the way that any person would think or write. Also, when we think about the differences between the pastoral epistles and what had come before, Paul writing to the Ephesians or to the Corinthians or to the Romans, Paul had been spending more and more time with Luke. Remember, only Luke was with him, and that may have affected Paul's communication style. And we will get to that once we enter into our study of the critical textual approach. So the preceding picture of the historical setting for Paul's relationship with Timothy and Titus, we've taken out from the book of Acts and from what details we find in the pastoral epistles. While every element is not provable, the question we can ask is this reconstruction consistent with what we find in Acts and what Paul writes to Timothy and Titus? And is it plausible? Is it possible that this is how things were laid out? Okay, so let me pause there. Do we have any comments or any questions up to this point in our study?
Dr. Tim, when was Paul beheaded? Whereas we know that during the time, crucifixion was the capital punishment for the Romans.
Okay, so as you know, Paul was a Roman citizen, and one of the benefits of being a Roman citizen was that you could not be crucified. So as a Roman citizen, you had certain rights. If you committed crimes, you had certain rights as to how you would be punished. Like, even for instance, when Paul was beaten in Philippi, when he makes mention of the fact that they are Roman citizens, the leaders become very fearful because, first of all, Philippi was a Roman colony, which means a Roman citizen enjoyed the same rights in a Roman colony as they did in the city of Rome itself. So when they beat Paul without giving him a trial, they were breaking the Roman rules. They were breaking the rules for Roman citizens. And that's why they were so fearful. But Paul was beheaded because as a Roman citizen, he had certain rights for how he would be tried, and then, if convicted, how he would be executed.
So only Roman citizens will enjoy the due process of law.
Well, to a degree, I guess you could say the Roman government had to follow the order of law with Roman citizens. Someone who was not a Roman citizen may get a trial, but the government would have been much more open to bypassing certain aspects of the legal things. So it would have been easier to try, convict, and execute someone who was not a Roman citizen. So Paul, as a Roman citizen, had the right to appeal to Caesar. And that's what he does when he's in prison, at Caesarea Philippi, when he's before, I think it's Festus. He eventually says, I've had enough of this. My rights as a Roman citizen are I can appeal directly to Caesar. And that's exactly what he does. He appeals to Caesar, and that's when he then travels to Rome under guard as a prisoner, and he is tried before Caesar's court. And that's a right of a Roman citizen. So that's why his imprisonments and also his punishments are in line with how they would have to treat a Roman citizen.
How about the case of Jesus?
Well, obviously, Jesus is not a Roman citizen, and so he did not enjoy any of the protections of the Roman citizenship. And that's why when you look at the trials of Jesus, most say he had 3 Jewish trials and then he had 3 Roman trials. Pilate, Herod, back to Pilate. So he was tried by the Jewish courts, but according to Roman law, once more, the right of capital punishment was reserved for the Roman government. They did not allow other governments to exercise capital punishment. And that's why when they bring Jesus to Pilate, Pilate says, you try him according to your law. You deal with him. And the Jewish leaders say, well, we aren't permitted to kill anyone, to exercise capital punishment. So that's why they brought him to Pilate, because the Romans were the ones who had the authority to exercise capital punishment. And that's why Jesus is crucified, because that was a very severe form of punishment for serious criminals. But he did not have the same rights as a Roman citizen would. If he was a Roman citizen, he could not have been legally crucified. But as a Jewish citizen, having been tried by the Jewish courts and then by the Roman courts, when they imposed the judgment, he was then crucified. All right, is that good? Any other questions? Everybody's good? Okay. Okay, so let's go ahead and we'll start this section. I don't know how far we will get, but we'll start this section, and we'll try to go until about 8 o'clock or so, maybe another 15 minutes. Now, I want us to talk through the situational issues, the theological and the practical issues that arise in the pastoral epistles. So, books of Scripture, these letters, are influenced to a greater and a lesser degree by the surrounding context. We're talking about the culture, theological issues, practical issues. For instance, when we studied the book of 1 Corinthians, the greatest situational impact as we interpret 1 Corinthians is the cultural issues. Remember, when we studied 1 Corinthians, if you don't have a grasp on the surrounding culture of the Corinthian church, the church was immersed in the culture, you're left in the dark on a number of important topics. So our view of what head coverings are and why they were important is tied in directly to the Corinthian culture, or the pagan temples and the food that was offered to idols. That is tied directly into the Corinthian culture. The immorality and just the pervasiveness of that immorality in the society, again, is tied into the culture. Now, when we come to the pastoral epistles, the surrounding culture exerts less of an influence. Okay, so the issue is not going to be so much on the culture of Ephesus, like it was for the Corinthians, or the culture of Crete, though it has a part it plays. Instead, we are going to see the theological and practical problems that rise to the surface that are facing the churches in Ephesus and Crete. So the theological and the practical problems take center stage in the pastoral epistles. Though the issues in Ephesus, right, 1st and 2nd Timothy, though they seem to be more pressing than the issues in Crete, the problems seem to arise from this mix of Judaism and Gnosticism. So if you ask, what's the main problem that Paul is having to deal with in the church at Ephesus or the churches on the island of Crete? The problems are very similar between these two places. And what you come up with is a heresy that is probably very similar to the heresy that was in Colossae, right? The book of Colossians. So I think what we could say is that the heresy that was found in the church at Colossae is the same heresy that Paul is addressing in the church at Ephesus and the churches on Crete. And it's this weird mixture of Jewish teachings and Greek thought that would later become Gnosticism, right? Does everybody know what I mean when I use the term Gnosticism, right? Gnosticism would teach this Platonic dualism, right? Okay, so you really can't understand Gnosticism or most of the theological heresies of the early church without understanding Platonic dualism. So this is from Greek thought, right? And this particular thought creeps into the church. And the basis and the foundation of this Platonic dualism is the division of matter and spirit. Okay, so you have this division. It's a hard break between matter and spirit, and matter is evil, right? And spirit is pure. Okay, so you wind up with this view that all matter is evil, but the spirit is pure. That is good. So matter, physical matter, flesh, is bad. Immaterial spirit is good. Matter is evil. Spirit is pure. And this view, oddly enough, leads to two extremes. It either leads to what we know as asceticism, okay? Asceticism is denying the body of physical cravings. So denying yourself of food, denying yourself of sleep, denying yourself of any kind of pleasure. So when you view the body as evil, then one extreme is to say, I need to deny my body of all of its cravings. So that leads to asceticism. The other extreme was the exact opposite, is hedonism. And hedonism is giving in to all of your bodily cravings. And it always amazes me that the same view leads to such extreme consequences. So Platonic dualism, which is Gnosticism at its foundation, will lead to either asceticism, denying the body of any physical cravings, or it will lead to hedonism, which means I give in to all of my bodily cravings, whether it is sexual, food, just any kind of pleasure. It's just giving in. And that really is the foundation of the theological issues within the Pastoral Epistles. So if you were to say what's the major theological issue that Paul deals with in the Pastoral Epistles, I would say it's a Jewish variety of Gnosticism, which again has its foundation in this Platonic dualism. Okay, so that makes sense? I know it's a lot of terms, but the foundation, the view is that matter is evil, the spirit is pure. Therefore, if matter is evil, you are either going to come to this side where you say, I need to deny my body of all its physical cravings. Or you come to this side where you say, if the body is evil, it doesn't matter what I do with my body. Right? The stomach is for food and food for the stomach. That was the Corinthian mindset. And this philosophy was the Greek philosophy of life. This is how Greeks thought. And this is the reason that the Greeks had such a problem with the resurrection. Because they could not get past the idea of God resurrecting matter, the physical body. They believed that the spirit was really imprisoned in this physical body, and the goal was for the spirit to be released and leave the body behind. But according to the gospel, God is going to redeem the body. God is going to resurrect the body. But the Greek mind thought that was foolish. They could not grasp that concept. And it's all because they believed this Platonic dualistic thought. That's how they thought. And that's what led to the rejection of the resurrection by most. So that becomes a very important issue. I think what we'll do right here, we're going to go ahead and stop here. Let me see, we've got a ways to go before we'll get to that next point. So let's go ahead and we're going to stop here, and let me just pause. Any questions? Any final questions? Maybe a question on this or something else that we've covered. Do you guys have any questions before we end out?
I have one question.
Yes.
How many times did Paul go to in a prison? There's we can see in Rome first imprisonment that we mentioned 2 years in Roman. So as we know, the prison epistles are written in that situation. So how many times did Paul goes a long time imprisonment in Paul's life? So
Yeah. So we have a couple records, like in Acts 16, he's put into the Philippian jail. But that was a very short period of time. I believe he makes a statement, maybe in 2 Corinthians, I think he says, in imprisonments often. If I remember right, he makes that statement. So he was imprisoned often. Most times it was probably short. He was imprisoned and told to get out of town and forced to leave town. Sometimes he was imprisoned for his own safety, like the riot in Jerusalem. He then spends 2 years in the prison in Caesarea Philippi before he then is sent to Rome, where he spends another 2 years. So that's 4 years right there in some type of imprisonment. And the imprisonment in Caesarea Philippi does not seem severe. The first imprisonment in Rome is house arrest. Again, does not seem severe. But he's imprisoned at least a second time, I believe. And that imprisonment seems extremely severe. And I would argue that Paul is even discouraged or depressed by the time he's in this second imprisonment. He's ready to be done with that imprisonment. He's ready to die, to go to be with the Lord. So we're not told, but he was imprisoned often, and at least for 4 years. Depending on his last imprisonment, that may have been another period of time. But he spent a good bit of time in prison. And then, as we mentioned, the book of Hebrews references Timothy, who was imprisoned as well. So it was a common event for these ministers and for these preachers of the gospel.
So, where did he write the prison epistle? Like in the first imprisonment, or the time that he spent in like Caesarea Philippi,
Right.
or something
Well,
like that?
that's a good question, and that's debated. We're not 100% sure. Most people believe the prison epistles were written when he was in the Roman imprisonment in Rome. There are some who believe that they were written when he was in Caesarea Philippi, but most would say those were written when he was in Rome. And the reason they would say that, in Philippians, Paul talks about how the whole Praetorium Guard had heard the gospel. And
Okay.
that could be a reference to Caesarea Philippi, but it's much more likely that's a reference to Rome. And then he also makes reference to Caesar's household. So it'd be hard to say it's Caesarea Philippi. It's possible. But most likely he was in Rome in that first Roman imprisonment when he wrote the prison epistles.
So, when did he met like Onesimus, slaves from the Valiante?
Right.
So, when did he met him, like Caesarea Philippi, or
Well,
Roman?
I would guess in the Roman imprisonment in Rome, because he says, I have begotten him in my bonds. So I led him to faith in my imprisonment. And when he's writing to Onesimus, when he's writing to the Philippians, it seems, again, that he's in Rome. So the most likely understanding is that he led Onesimus to the Lord in Rome while under his house arrest.
So, there's my thought. So I just want to ask you that, like, he is in house imprisonment. So how did they met each other? Like Onesimus is something like a slave, so
Right.
he's gonna be like in somewhere else. So how did they met each other?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I mean, when you end out the yeah, when you end out the book of Acts, so I'm going to read Acts 28. It just says, "Then Paul dwelt 2 whole years in his own rented house and received all who came to him." So people could come to him. He rented out a house. They could come. They could go. And it says he was preaching the kingdom of God and teaching the things which concern the Lord Jesus Christ with all confidence, no one forbidding him. So from the simple statement of Acts, Paul is able to welcome into his own home under house arrest anyone that wants to come. And so no doubt Paul simply opened up his home, and somewhere along the way, Onesimus came in. We don't have any of the details, but likely Onesimus came in, heard the gospel, was saved, and then Paul sends a letter, to Philemon on his behalf. So that's our best guess, my best guess. All right, any final?
I was thinking like Onesimus is like a person that in a Roman rule and regulations, like a policy. So if a slave ran away from his master, like they got killed or something like that. So
Right.
I believe Onesimus, can he get out from the prison to meet Paul's, or when they went to the way to the prison, like his imprisonment for the run away from his master or something like that. So that thoughts come into me.
I
So
see.
I just
Well,
want to know.
we're not told that Onesimus was in prison. That's possible, but not likely, because they would have, like you said, they would have either killed him or they would have sent him back to his master. But my assumption, take it for what it's worth, is that Onesimus came to Paul. Obviously, he would not have made a statement, "I'm a runaway slave, everyone." He could have come to Paul, not stating his position, and then is saved, and then wants to make things right with his master. So that would be, again, it's speculation. So anything I say is just my thought.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I see. Yeah. I could figure it out right now.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. All right. Any final question? We're good?
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you guys. Let's pray. Thank you guys for the good study. I'm excited. This is going to be a great study. The introduction of this study is more in depth than the introduction to our study of Corinthians, for example. But I believe it's going to be helpful. Next time, we'll especially get into some of the critical textual views, liberal scholarship, and hopefully that will be a help to you, not just for these books, but for the New Testament. So let's go ahead and let's pray and thank the Lord. Father, thank you for these men. Thank you for their ministries. Protect them. Help them to live out the gospel. Give them encouragement when they suffer. Give them encouragement to just preach your word, to be faithful. And I pray that you'll be glorified in all of this. thank you for this time, and we pray for a good rest of the day for these guys and a good week ahead. And bless us now, we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so I'll see you guys next Monday. Yes, so good to see you guys. Good to see your face.
Okay.
All right.